burned down.
Yeah.
Like all of like those animals die in the boat.
Yeah. Sorry. I know. Sad. He survived though. Didn't it look kind of like he was smiling at the end when his ship was about to crash in the sea? I thought that was kind of weird, but I don't think he was actually happy. All right, so here's our notes. So these are fennec foxes. They live in North Africa. So what do you know? Like, what's the first thing you notice about them besides them being really cute? Yeah, that's what makes them cute, isn't it? They have huge ears. So what I want you to just think about for a second, like, why do they have huge ears? Well, I guess let me ask you this question first. Like, why do any species have the characteristics that they have? What's that, Jenna? Okay, what about, I mean, let's start just in general, though. Like, why do squirrels have a long, bushy tail, and these fennec foxes have these huge ears, and a camel has a hump? Aiden?
They adapted to their environment.
Yeah, every species that is present on Earth over time has adapted, has evolved to have certain traits, certain characteristics that allow it to be successful, to allow it to survive and reproduce. So you can look at a species and you could try to figure out, okay, well, why does a squirrel have a bushy tail? Why do humans have hair on their head? Why do these fennec foxes have these ears? So in just sort of thinking about that, give me some ideas. What would the advantage of these giant ears be? So Jenna, you started saying something. Why don't you go ahead and tell us? To hear predators coming? Is that reasonable? Yeah, probably big ears maybe could pick up sounds from farther away. Are there any other ideas? Well, let me ask. Well, I guess would those ears though maybe like make them stand out more to predators? I don't know. Maybe not. I'm not sure. Can anyone think of another reason that the fennec foxes might have evolved to have huge ears?
Heat.
What, Francis?
The heat.
Okay, why do you say that?
Cool off.
Okay, so where do these fennec? I told you from North Africa. Anybody know what it's like in North Africa? Hot desert. Yeah, desert conditions, pretty much.
Yeah.
So maybe to cool off. Good idea. Any other ideas? What these huge ears might be for? What's that?
Showing off.
Okay. When do organisms show off? Yeah. So lots of organisms have adaptations for mating. Lots of times when we see that, and we'll talk more about this, which often it's not equal between male and female organisms, which are often the showier versions. Yeah, males are often more brightly colored, larger feathers, more showy patterns on their fur. Yeah, that is often the case. So that's another good idea. All right. I'm not going to tell you why just yet. Just keep you wondering, or maybe you already looked it up. All right. So let's talk a little bit about evolution. Let's start with just the basics. Right. What is evolution? Evolution is a change in a species over a period of time. That's all. Pretty simple. That a species can change over time. That's what evolution is. But there's something really important to remember and to keep in mind, because this is a very common mistake that people make. is it's an individual cannot evolve over time. An individual squirrel, for example, is born with certain traits and characteristics. They're not going to change during its lifetime. An individual can't evolve, right? It's born with whatever it has in its genetics, and that's all it's going to have. It's either going to live or die. But a group, a population, a species can change over time. And that happens through a process called natural selection or through other processes, which we'll talk about. So sometimes what can be confusing is some of the terminology that we use. So in science, evolution is a theory. But when we use the word theory in science, it means something different than kind of like our everyday usage. Because our everyday usage of the word theory, what does that sort of mean to us?
It's like an idea. There's not much behind it.
Kind of like a guess or like a prediction. Like you're watching Law and Order, and you might say, well, I have a theory about who the killer is. And when we use it in our everyday language, we kind of think it as, well, you think it, but you're not really sure. But what's different is in science, when we use the word theory, it means something very different. It almost means the opposite. Like the theory of gravity, cell theory. Okay, these are things that have been researched, have been experimented with many, many times. They've been demonstrated to be correct through multiple experiments and different variations. So when we use the word theory in science, we kind of mean scientists are sure of this, as sure as you can be about something in science, right? In science, we say we're never 100% sure about anything. There could be some experiment that changes all of our thinking about gravity or cells or evolution or any other scientific theory. But chances are that's not going to happen. These theories have been confirmed over and over and over again. And so evolution is a theory. We know that species evolve over time. We've seen it happen within experiments. We have evidence of it that we're going to be talking about today. So just be careful of that word theory, because sometimes people that want to argue against evolution, they say, well, evolution's just a theory. And that's sort of confusing those two ways that we use the term. Like for this, so this is this diagram in our notes. This is showing us the evolution of what? Yeah, this is the evolution of whales. These are like artist renditions of what whale ancestors likely looked like based on fossil evidence. Whales are marine mammals. They look a lot like fish, but they're not fish. They actually evolved from terrestrial mammals, mammals that lived on land. And over a long period of time, the species evolved. Now, it doesn't mean that this little individual wolf-like creature didn't evolve into a whale. That's what we mean. Individuals can't evolve. But the whole population or a group of them can evolve over time. So let's just talk briefly about some of the history of evolutionary thought. Because we think about Darwin, we think about evolution, we think this is a very new concept. But actually, as far back as like ancient Greece, the Greeks had the idea that one species can develop from a previous species, and that's evolution. So that's in ancient Greece. Okay? In China, Taoism had the idea that species are not fixed, that they can change over time. In ancient Rome, Lucretius talked about the development of the earth over time. These are all ideas that are connected to evolution. even though it's well before Darwin, 2,000 years, 3,000 years ago. As we move through history, we get to the Middle Ages. Okay? In the Middle Ages, most Christians believe that the species in special creation, which we just learned about, that species were created by God and they are fixed. They're unchanging. They're perfect. And each organism had its place. However, around the same times, Islamic philosophers were writing about ideas regarding evolution, that species could change over time. When we get into the Renaissance and Enlightenment times, the 16, 17, 1800s, at that time, still most people in the early parts of those eras, most people, even scientists, believed in special creation. Most scientists believed, and almost everyone believed, the Earth was only 6,000 years old. In this time, in the early Enlightenment, people tried to use the Bible and count back generations and try to figure out how old the Earth was. And when they did that, the number that they sort of settled upon was 6,000 years old. If you go back through the biblical generations, you eventually arrive at about 6,000 years when God created the Earth. There were some people that questioned some of these ideas. Buffon was an 18th century French naturalist who said that a lot of the ideas we know about evolution from Darwin actually were proposed earlier on, that modern forms of organisms can come from other forms, that species that are similar might share a common ancestor, and that the Earth is much older than people were saying. When we get to the 19th century, we have sort of an explosion of scientific thinking about lots of topics, including evolution. And so one important advance was in geology. Okay, in geology, two geologists called Hutton and Lyell, they started to propose the idea the Earth is not 6,000 years old. It is much, much older than that. People started, or didn't start, but continued discovering fossils of species that were no longer present. Okay? And started to ask questions about, well, where are these species now? Where did they go? We find these fossils of dinosaurs. Well, how does that fit in with this idea of special creation? In 1809, scientist Lamarck proposed the idea species adapt to their environment. His ideas about how they do that were incorrect. He believed in this idea of use and disuse, that the more a species used a certain structure, the bigger or the stronger it would become over time. For example, Lamarck said giraffes have very long necks because they constantly stretch them to reach the leaves in the trees. And then generation after generation, they evolve to get longer. We know now that's not how it works. Even if a giraffe could stretch its neck a little bit because it's reaching for the leaves, that wouldn't be passed on to the next generation, right? Because that's a change in its neck and its muscles. The only thing that gets passed on are actually genes and chromosomes and DNA. So people were starting to push forward their thoughts about evolution. Okay? Also, economics even comes into play. Thomas Malthus in the 1798 wrote about population growth. He was talking really about humans. And what he was noticing and he observed in nature is that when organisms have offspring, they always produce more offspring than can possibly survive. Right? If a fish lays eggs and they're fertilized, a fish can lay tens or hundreds of thousands of eggs at one time. they all possibly could not survive. If they did, then streams would be just clogged with fish. More offspring are born than can survive. And the question becomes, well, then which ones are going to survive? And this is where Darwin and Wallace started to think about, well, which ones will survive? And what does that mean? Then we get to Darwin and Wallace. It was 1858 when Darwin and Wallace proposed their idea together of common descent through natural selection, that species change over time through this process called natural selection. Darwin was older than Wallace. He had traveled extensively. As you learned, he traveled on the Beagle. This map shows the path of the Beagle. So they started in England, came down to South America, to the eastern coast of South America, bounced around Brazil, went around the tip of Argentina, around the continent, bounced up the western coast of South America, eventually explored the Galapagos Islands, which are very famous in terms of Darwin's research. We'll talk more about them. Then they continued on to Australia and New Zealand, eventually around Australia, around the southern tip of Africa, back to South America again, and then back up eventually to England. So huge journey, obviously. Took them years. Darwin was 22 when he was on this journey, and basically he collected specimens. When they would land in various locations, he would go out, he would explore the natural world, he might collect fossils, he would collect animals and plants, he would study the rocks. He was sort of a general, all-around scientist. He'd collected a lot of things. Okay? He brought them back eventually to England and studied them in more detail. And so then when he got back to England, as you know, he wrote several books about his journey and other scientific principles, but not about evolution. It wasn't until Wallace told Darwin basically he had come up with the same ideas that Darwin did publish his book. It was called On the Origin of the Species. It really became very popular. Now, he had already shared it with close friends, so that was how they were able to confirm that he came up with these ideas first. And in The Origin of the Species, this is where Darwin proposes his theory called natural selection. Natural selection tells us how species change. So evolution tells us species change over time. Natural selection tells us how that happens. So evolution is what happens. Natural selection is how. When we look at sort of some of these ideas on a timeline, we can see things going on in history, whether it's the Civil War, the Revolution, the French Revolution. We could see sort of where different things happened. And again, these are some of the things I just talked about. Hutton, Malthus, Lamarck, Lyell, Darwin. And so there were a huge number of ideas that were being proposed at this time. So the question then becomes, well, how do we know? How do we know species change over time? What is the evidence that we have for evolution? Well, we'll talk about several types of evidence. Okay. One of the earliest types of evidence that scientists had for evolution was fossils. So fossil is the remains of a species that is, sometimes it's an impression of a species, sometimes it's a mold of it, sometimes it's traces of those species, but scientists have been finding fossils for a long time. And when we study the fossil record, what we see is that 99% of the species that have ever existed on Earth are extinct. Right? They lived in the past. What we see today, it's only about 1% of all the species that have ever lived. And unfortunately, due to humans, that's decreasing even more. But we'll talk about that in a later unit. We can also use different scientific tools to help us understand how old fossils are, how old different rocks are. And I think you guys probably learned about that in earth science last year, about radioactive dating, that we can look at different radioactive elements to see how old something is. And scientists know the Earth is about 4.6 billion years old. It's much older than the 6,000 years that most people believe back in the 1700s. 4.6 billion years is a huge time period. We almost can't even comprehend how long that is. And so that provides a very long time for evolution to produce the diversity of life that we see around us and in the fossil record. Couple things here. So this is a trilobite. Probably you can recognize that. Anyone know what this is a diagram, a photo of? It's these things. What you're looking at are these things. What could they be? Mary?
Mr. Ross, are you sharing your screen?
Am I not sure? Oh my God.
I can't see it. I don't know.
So I just been talking this whole time. You guys can't see this?
Who never knows?
I know. That's super weird. I'm sorry. Thanks, Mary, for telling me 20 minutes later. But thank you. At least you told me. Everyone else is just going to sit here. This is what I thought you were going to be seeing. Oh, hold on one sec. Let me change something. Oh my God. Now we're good? All right. What I was talking about is this diagram. What are these things? Any ideas? What's that? Yeah, these are dinosaur tracks. These are the fossilized, at some point, whatever, 70 million years ago, a dinosaur walked across some mud. Okay, left those imprints. And then somehow that mud got covered up. Maybe some sand blew on it or some silt or something got covered up and buried and eventually solidified into rock. And so the impression of these dinosaurs stepping across have been preserved in the stone. We also have fossils like that of human ancestor footprints across the mud from Africa that are really neat. What's this?
Pterodactyl fossil?
You're on the right track, Francesca. It's not a pterodactyl, though. Pterodactyls were reptiles. What, can anyone see anything like... But you're very close, Francesca. Can you see anything here? What's that look like? What's that?
Wings?
Yeah, those are feathers. This is a famous fossil. This is called Archaeopteryx. You ever heard of that? It was a fossil that scientists found in Germany. And what it shows is what's called a transitional fossil. It shows us a species that is giving us a step along the way. Because where did birds evolve from? Does anybody know that? Yeah, they evolved from reptiles. And so this fossil, Archaeopteryx, has some characteristics that are bird-like. It's got feathers. Okay. It's got wings. It also, though, has some reptile-like characteristics. Okay, and the reptile-like characteristics are like a bony tail, claws at the end of the wings. It's got teeth in its jaw. So it's showing us sort of this in-between organism. It's no longer alive today, but this transitional fossil helps us understand how one group of reptiles evolved eventually into birds. So this is telling us, this is giving us evidence that species have changed over time. These are fossils of horses. Horses did not always look like they do today. Okay. 50 million years ago, horses were small, dog-sized creatures with toes. Today we know horses are much larger creatures, and they have hooves rather than toes on their feet. We also, though, have fossils in between that show us these steps. Scientists have found fossils going back through the fossil record, showing us kind of the steps that ancestors took in the evolution to become what we know are modern horses. So this is evidence for evolution that species have changed over time. We can also see by looking at species the structures that they have, the features. And so we can look at these structures in their anatomy, and it can give us some clues as to how they've evolved. So there's two categories of these structures we look at often. One is called homologous structures, and one are called vestigial structures. Homologous structures are evidence that species evolved from other species. For example, this is what the bones of a human arm, a whale flipper, and a bat's wing look like. Now, if we just looked at those species outwardly, we might say, well, a human arm, a whale flipper, and a bat's wing, those are nothing alike. Right? One's used to fly, one's used to swim, one's used to grab things. However, when we look more closely, when we look at the bones of those organisms, we see, well, actually, inside of a whale's flipper are bones that look much like a human hand. Inside the wing of that bat are bones that look like the finger bones of the whale. The number of bones are the same. You have one upper arm bone, the humerus. You have two forearm bones. You have wrist bones. You have finger bones. So what this tells us is that, well, why would a whale flipper have all of these bones inside of it? What's the answer to that question? They have the way we phrase that. You're right, Jenna. The idea is right. The way we phrase it is that they all had a common ancestor. That they all evolved. If you trace back their ancestry, eventually you would find an organism that's a common ancestor of a human and a whale and a bat. And likely that common ancestor had similar types of bones. And that's why each of these species have those bones, because they've been preserved over the generations, over millions of years. They're still present, and we can use those as evidence for evolution, that species evolved from common ancestors. There are other structures called vestigial structures. These are things that are kind of like leftovers from evolution. They also give us an idea about ancestry and evolution. For example, in a snake, what kind of animal is a snake? It's a reptile. It's related to lizards, but obviously a snake has no legs. It evolved not to have legs. However, when you look inside the skeleton of a snake, what you can see is there's still like these small bones they don't seem to do anything. They're tiny little leg bones that are there inside of the snake. And so what does that tell us? Again, it's evidence that these snakes in general, evolved from ancestors who probably had 4 legs. And these bones have been minimized through evolution, but they're still there. They're still giving us some clues as to the evolution of these snakes. Some people say the human appendix is a vestigial structure. It's not really shows us the ancestry of humans, or muscles that move our ears. Can anyone move their ears? I can't. You know, you ever see people that can like move their ears? No one can do it here? Anyone want to demonstrate? I don't even know how to like try and do it. I always just like end up smiling or like doing something weird. All right. We can also look at, when we look at the embryos of different organisms, that can give us some information about how they've evolved. Closely related species go through similar stages in their embryonic development. But these are 4 different organisms: human, a pig, a tortoise, okay, and a lizard. So obviously those are different organisms. But when you look back in their embryological development, in the very earliest stages, they all look very similar. They actually all, even vertebrates that have lungs, in their early development, they actually have gills that eventually go away. And so what does this tell us? This gives us some evidence about how these species evolved and what they evolved from. You know, when you try to compare them, like the lizard and the tortoise look more similar later into their development, whereas the other species start to become different from each other. So that can help us understand how they're related to each other. And then a more modern form of evidence that we have is molecular evidence. So all species, all living organisms have the same genetic code. And we'll learn about it later in the year. And so if we take an enzyme, for example, that's found in humans and other organisms, like one that's commonly used is something called cytochrome C. If we compare that molecule between different species, what we sometimes find is that there's slight differences. And those differences help us to understand how closely related species are. For example, if we look at this molecule, cytochrome C, in humans and compare it to cytochrome C in chimps, it's exactly the same. If we compare human cytochrome C to mouse cytochrome C, it's very similar, but there are some differences. It's 91% similar. And if we continue looking down, if we compare human cytochrome C to corn, we see still similar, but 66%. So what is this telling us? It's telling us that humans are most closely related to chimps, and then mice, and so on. And so if you go back in time through evolution, what we would say is that humans and chimps had a common ancestor in the past, earlier than humans and a carp had a common ancestor. Here we see it just sort of in a numerical form, comparing humans. Again, this is cytochrome C. Humans compared to a rat, a mouse, chicken, fruit fly, yeast, okay, and so forth. And so you could see the sort of differences in human cytochrome C is most similar to a mouse, then a rat, then a chicken, then a fruit fly, then yeast. So again, this is evidence over time that species have evolved. Okay, we're going to stop today with the evidence. So that's all the evidence we're going to talk about for evolution. So we'll stop here.